Hello, everyone. My name is Emily, and this is the 7th episode of the Reading Buddy Book Club for July, where we are reading Race to the Bottom of the Sea by Lindsay Eagar. I hope you guys are enjoying the last bits of summer. Before we get into reading, I just want to remind you to grab your reading buddy, get comfy, maybe grab a snack or a drink, and let's go. A drop of rain falls from a cloud and lands on a mountain peak. Another joins, and another, and another. A trickle, and a creek is born. The creek runs down the mountainside, gaining speed and momentum, and becomes a river, loud and crushing, a living thing. The river cuts through the land and empties into the ocean. Our ocean is made of these droplets, smaller than pebbles. A tiny drop of water on its own may barely wet a parched throat, but an entire ocean of droplets becomes the most powerful force on the planet. Exploring an underwater fairyland with Dr. and Dr. Quail. Chapter 21. Fidelia fell into memories of what it was like to spend days at a time on the water, long spans of tedium, followed by mild insanity. The Jewel had covered an incredible distance in a small amount of time, had sailed through 3 oceanic climates, down most of the mainland coast, and had even survived a run-in with the undertow. "We're close," Merrick said between coughs. And as soon as the sunlight was strong enough, Fidelia parked herself near the portside railing with her binoculars and began scanning for seagrass meadows. The ocean levels had shrunk. The Jewel was cruising through water depths of less than 100 feet now, and Fidelia spotted the many animals of the sunlit zone. A lone bluefin tuna, who darted away from the ship at double speed, 3 or 4 hammerheads, their strange craniums oscillating as they swam, a few men-of-war undulating like tissues in the water, and a common white surf clam. A clam! She watched it closely as they moved past it. It yawned open, basking in the sunlight on its massive pink tongue, then sank down below the surface. Fidelia smiled. It felt like a message from her parents. "Hold on, you're so close. Just get his treasure and then you'll go home." There, she pointed to a patch about 50 yards away, dark and amorphous, swaying under the water like a fluid sea monster, its strands floating to the surface like green mermaid's hair. The captain, at the helm, was huddled in his peacoat, despite the warm temperature of the tropics, but he motioned for Bloody Elle to climb down the rope, dangling from the stern, and pick a few leaves. "You're putting your life in the hands of a leaf?" Cheap Shot Charlie stared at the parrot feather leaf with utter distrust. "Absolutely," Fidelia said. She took the leaf to the bench, unscrewed the water heater, and placed her new filter in its position. It fit perfectly, just as she'd known it would. "That thing is really going to let you breathe underwater?" Fidelia turned the water heater around and around, a final check for any kinks or wrinkles. "If I'm truly the inventor Merrick believes I am, then yes." "Captain won't get this wrong," Bloody Elle said. "It's too important." She reached out a hand and touched the dried tar, her swallow tattoo fluttering its wings as her fingers moved. She watched Fidelia looking at the bird. "You said you've been to Conquillas?" "I've been to the coast," Fidelia said. "Then you know Conquillas is the most beautiful country in the world," Bloody Elle said. "Those crystal-clear lagoons, the white-capped mountains. Yucca on every hill, but it is very poor, so poor that I was picking pockets by age 4, and by age 10, I was the breadwinner in my family." Fidelia set down her water heater, listening. "With a dead mother, 2 younger sisters, and a crippled father, what else could I do? I stole food, coins, shoes, anything that wasn't strapped down," Bloody Elle said. "Every time Les Beaufils caught me, they locked me in the Bastille for the night and slapped one of their brands on me." She held up her wrist. The bold black lines circumnavigated her flesh. "Conquillas puts permanent cuffs on their prisoners. That way every villager knows, when you reach out to shake their hand, that you're a thief." Fidelia ran her eyes along the tattoos, losing count after 20 lines. "How many times were you caught?" Bloody Elle lifted the billowing sleeve of her blouse. The black lines continued all the way up her bicep. "They ran out of room by the end. But my family always had rice and beans, and so did the widow next door, and the homeless dog that scratched at our back door for bones." Fidelia pointed at the swallow tattoo on Bloody Elle's hand. What does the bird mean? Bloody Elle smiled. I got this the night I stole a uniform. A uniform? Took it right off a member of the Royal Guard, Bloody Elle said, her eyes twinkling. I found him staggering drunk by the river and persuaded him to go for a dip. She grinned. I ran off with his velvet tunic and bearskins and strolled right into the Bastille. Unlocked a few of my friends and anyone else who asked to be released. Her expression turned serious. There was only one prisoner who didn't cry out for me to break him free. Merrick, Fidelia guessed. Yes, Bloody Elle said. You're wasting your talents here, he told me. This village is too small for you. Come work for me, and your only bounds will be where the sea ends and the sky begins. But I told him I wouldn't leave my family behind to rot, and he promised me to see them taken care of, if only I would come to a ship right that minute and become a thief on the sea. She laughed. He also threatened to slit my throat if I said no. That threat's emptier than the mayor's wine jug, I told him, considering you're still behind bars. But then he held up the keys and jingled them. I still don't know how he lifted them off me. He opened his cell and put his knife to my neck, and that's when I knew I'd found my captain. Bloody Elle's iron eyes went soft and misty as she immersed herself in the memory. See, the lines around my wrist were from the Bastille, chains, black reminders of a black life, but the bird is because I flew away. She traced a finger along the swallow's outspread arms. Captain helped me fly away. As soon as we hit open water, he inked this himself. Fidelia frowned. What about your family? Captain was true to his word, Bloody Elle said. He saw that they were taken care of. Whenever we sailed past the Conquian coast, I could see my family's manor on the cliffs. They have gardens now, and servants. Finally, she looked right at Fidelia, her face once again hardening into sun-scorched skin and wind-weathered lines. When Captain says he'll do something, he means it. So when he tells you he'll kill you if you don't find his treasure, you better believe him. She patted Fidelia's knee as she stood, then left Fidelia alone to study her water eater yet again, her only tool against Merrick the Monstrous's cruelty. And suddenly, she could see it in the way the pirates saw it, a bunch of garbage glued together, tarred and punctured, now with a piece of seaweed stuck in the middle of the mess, her last hope. Just when Fidelia recognized the looks on everyone's faces, about to topple from mere boredom into stir-crazy, Merrick suddenly pointed. I see our stretch. Cheapshot Charlie and Bloody Elle hurried to slack the sails. Fidelia shot from her seat like a firecracker. The Jewel approached a sandbar, a spot in the sea where the water became shallow, turquoise, glassy clear, still as a mirror. Fidelia guessed it was about 30 feet deep. Nearby, maybe another mile's sail, a tropical island's mangrove trees lined the white shores, the roots dipping down into the sea like legs, testing the water for warmth. Mangroves. They were hubs for all sorts of hot water species, mud lobsters, sponges, brown pelicans, hawksbill turtles. Oh, how her parents would have loved to see this, a feast for the fish lover's eyes. She watched the multicolored fish darting through a coral reef, bodies glittering like jewels through the water, until a cough brought her back to the grim reality of her situation. Quail, Merrick said. Time to prove your salt. Fidelia took a deep breath and joined the pirate captain at the stern of the ship. Cheapshot Charlie and Bloody Elle had dropped anchor and flanked Merrick with faces like stone gargoyles, no gratitude for Fidelia helping them escape from the Mulvanian pirates, or helping them tie down loose lines, or helping them remove the barnacles from their ship. They were there to intervene, should she cause any trouble for this, the big moment. This was it, the reason they had taken her. I'll be blunt. Merrick's blue eye burned bright against the clear sea. The cave is filled to the brim with treasures, everything I've collected for nearly a decade. It is the result of sweaty, bloody work, both my own and my crew's. You said, Fidelia's voice threatened to crumble, her entire body seizing up in fear. You said you weren't sending me into the cave. Her water eater was supposed to separate oxygen from water. She had no idea if it would work as a death pollen filter. I'm not. Merrick's nostrils flared as he coughed. His patience was as thin as the lining of his lungs. You are not to go inside the cave. He paused, wiping the speckles of blood from around his mouth. You will bring up one thing, and one thing only. A brooch. A brooch. A small pewter brooch. Fidelia frowned. But pewter is junk metal, she said. It's probably been eaten away by the salt water. It isn't worth anything. It's worth everything, Merrick growled. Fidelia blinked at him, waiting for the bottom line, but Merrick was silent. That's it? You want me to dive down and find a pewter brooch? Easier said than done, Merrick said. It's lost somewhere in the seabed. Lost? Fidelia asked. Lost how? I pulled it out of the cave, but I dropped it in the algae when... He ended his sentence with a cough. It's down there, he growled, but it's up to you to find it. All of this for a pewter brooch. Fidelia was incredulous. All of this and much more. Merrick coughed his horrible cough, and his meaning couldn't have been clearer. Now, put on your wonder gills and get me my treasure. She untied her boots. Follow the reef down about 20 feet, Merrick said, as she held up the water eater for one more inspection, her hands shaking. The water eater. This time, if it didn't work... No, best not to dwell on the negative. Arthur and Ida would never have allowed such pessimistic what-ifs. Just pretend it's another test run, she coached herself. Pretend Mom and Dad are here, and you're just doing one more analysis before you send the blueprints off to the patent office. She tried to rub the fog off the mask, then spat into the visor. That's vile, Merrick wheezed, but effective. She secured the mask over her glasses and sat on the edge of the jewel, glancing at the pirate captain. Did you or did you not kidnap me because of my diving expertise? I did not, Merrick said, and broke into coughs. I kidnapped you because of your shark expertise. Before Fidelia could fully process what he said, Merrick pushed her backward off the ship and into the water. Chapter 22. Underwater, the world was quiet. Fidelia gently eased her eyes open. A trace amount of seawater leaked into her mask, typical of even the best diving equipment. It made her head feel like a pitcher, sloshing with every movement. After a moment, her eyes adjusted to the dimness of life beneath the surface. She glanced up, where the jewel floated like a giant lily pad. The water blurred and distorted the dry world above. Bloody Elle and Cheapshot Charlie peeked over the jewel's railing, their faces stretched long and bulbous, as though they were looking through a funhouse mirror. Merrick stared at her, too, blue eye narrowed in concentration. His black and red eye hung dead, magnified, through the sea. Her lungs felt wrenched. All of the oxygen she'd taken in at the surface was gone. It was time to take a breath. She steadied herself in the water, made sure her lips were fully sealed around the mouthpiece, and inhaled. Oxygen seeped into her mouth, just as it had in the grotto, so she didn't celebrate yet. Another inhale, and more oxygen. A third inhale, filling her lungs to capacity, and she knew it was working. The parrot feather leaf. It filtered the oxygen at just the right rate. Leave it to the ocean to grow the perfect substitute for gills. If only her father were here to see this. She kicked her feet, propelling forward, downward. The light shifted. The oranges of the sun flowed down to the sandy pink ocean floor, swirling with the turquoise water in a river of color. Fidelia had seen many shoals before, and sandbars, and continental shelves, but none as rich or vivid as this. The scientist in her kicked in. She analyzed the area and took mental notes. Water depth from surface to seabed, approximately 20 feet at the shoal's highest peak. Climate, subtropical. To her right, the coral reef. To her left, the seagrass meadow, swaying in the current. Here and there, piles of blackened wood splinters were half buried in the sand, remnants of ships that had run aground or wrecked along this very stretch. Schools of fish darted around the ships as if they were gauntlets to be bested. Where were the rocks responsible for these shipwrecks? She noticed tatters on the seabed, the Navy's flags, there, and an old shredded skull and crossbones leering at her from the sand. These vessels had been sunk by man, not by nature. By one man, by Merrick. The reef stretched to the surface, deep purple and braided and beautiful. Reefs always attracted the most bizarre of creatures, as if nature used this habitat to experiment with every possible design. A red-frilled dancer bent and gyrated past Fidelia's nose. Dainty garden eels popped their heads out from the coral's many pockets, sensing a visitor. Down on the carpet of algae along the reef's base, a row of giant purple clams pursed their lips. Fidelia arced her body down in the water, swimming around the reef. The water brightened, and the row of clams twitched their lips, kissing the sunlight streaming from above. Everything on the seabed glittered and shone as Fidelia swam down. The cave. She spotted the opening at the base of the reef, that gaping black mouth, the cave where the red daisies grew, the source of the legends, the cave that killed Merrick. Just inside its dark entry, she could see the treasure piled everywhere. A wooden chest overflowed with strands of pearls in all sizes, expensive-looking silvery rope coiled on the golden bed frame. A ritzy crystal chandelier was now home to a family of seahorses. She spotted bowls of emeralds and ruby rings, and gilded goblets with engravings around the side, and blue and white china dishes in stacks. Starfish rested atop mountains of doubloons. Piles and piles of gold coins cascaded into the algae lining the floor of the cave. Fidelia scanned this litter of treasure. Merrick could be living like a king, she realized, instead of hiding as an outlaw. This was the kind of wealth that allowed a person to relocate, live as someone else, disappear forever. Why hadn't Merrick done that? Why had he risked everything for some junky brooch? She shook the mystery from her head, the brooch, the thing she was here to find. She would find it, and then she was going home. She searched with both hands, her fingers melting through the slippery algae that coated the base of the coral. Finding this brooch was like hunting for a pewter needle in a haystack. She'd never be able to find it this way, 1 square foot at a time. It would take her days. No, she had to do this logically, like a scientist. No, not like a scientist, like a librarian. She darted up to the surface and removed the water eater, breathing deeply. "Merrick," she called, "get the book out of my bag." "Which book?" "Exploring an underwater fairyland," she called, treading water. "I saved it from your bonfire." "You mean you stole it?" Merrick found the book and flipped through the pages. "Should I toss it down to you? See if knowledge floats or sinks?" "No," Fidelia said. "Find the section on spring gales, and tell me which wind blows the undertow clear." If she knew exactly which direction the tides pushed come springtime, then she would know whether the sand and algae had come from the west, bringing residue from a nearby island's mangrove roots, or from the east, bringing the bulkier, brinier sands of the mainland. Merrick tore through the pages. "West," he finally said. "Mid-oceanic islands near the continental margins experience a shift in currents semi-annually, both with the arrival of the undertow and the dispersal of the undertow, when western winds and showers bring in the springtime and chase the undertow offshore. Softer, siltier residue then." She took another breath, replaced the water eater, and dove back under. As she plunged back to the bottom of the sea, she plotted out the brooch's drop in the water, refiguring where it could be with the westerly shift in the currents. The water's pull wouldn't have brought it toward the cave. It would have brought it. The clouds shifted, darkening Fidelia's view momentarily. She tried to find the light, but the shadow moved with her, a torpedo-shaped shadow circling above her. She looked up and froze. Shark! She swam to the other side of the reef, legs tingling with nerves, and peeked through the coral at the beast. Her water eater nearly fell out of her mouth. Grizzle! She could never forget the bone-white scar wrapping around his dorsal fin, or that mouth, as big around as Arborley Library's double doors, teeth hanging down like icicles. She felt like she might explode in her own skin. Of all the reefs in the seas, Grizzle was here. But this isn't a field study, she reminded herself. She couldn't hide behind the reef and observe this glorious creature until daylight faded. No, her very life depended on finding Merrick's brooch, a task that had just become even trickier. A shark's tail was a metric for reading its emotions, just like a dog's. Grizzle's tail was relaxed, straight as an arrow. He was still only curious about the underwater visitor hiding behind the reef. If his tail flicked in small, annoying movements, that meant aggression, which meant trouble. Keep calm. The voices of the doctor's quail echoed in Fidelia's mind. Find the brooch. Get back in the ship. Grizzle doesn't have to be a dangerous factor. Just focus. Westerly winds, a spring gale, pushing tides west. Look for the mangrove root residue. That patch of algae, there, dusted with a fine layer of silt, nestled right where the coral sprung from the ocean floor. That's where the brooch would be. Keeping an eye on Grizzle, she moved as gracefully as she could. Water resistance was draining. She needed to conserve her energy. Breathing slowly through the water eater, she kicked further down, stretching to the seafloor. Grizzle passed her again, giving her a bit of a nudge with his blunt nose. Her brain fizzed and smoked with warnings. The shark's attitude had changed. He dropped his pectoral fins and swam from side to side in an exaggerated pattern. This was predatory behavior. Fidelia reached the sea bottom and dipped her hands into a soft, slippery algae. It had to be there. Where was it? Where was it? The shark nudged her again, harder, throwing her off balance. Desperate, she searched faster, her fingers sliding in and out of the algae. The brooch, the brooch, the brooch. Grizzle bumped her again, and this time it knocked her mask clean off. She squeezed her eyes shut and fumbled for it, panicking as she felt it float out of her grasp. Prying her eyes open, she swallowed a gasp when the salt stung. It was uncomfortable, yes, and everything was blurry, even with her glasses. But she had to find that brooch and get out of the water. Grizzle's patience wouldn't last much longer, and then she'd be on the receiving end of one of his bolder moves. A bite, perhaps. She sucked in air, trying to calm her heart, and strained for air. Her water eater. The oxygen was thin, barely enough for a mouthful. What was happening to the parrot feather leaf? Why wasn't it working? Searching the algae in a frenzy, she glanced over her shoulder for the shark, as if it would help when she could barely see 2 feet in front of her. Her brain was practically shouting instructions at her. You can't see. You need air. Go tell Merrick the brooch is lost forever. Do it before Grizzle loses his temper. But then her fingers touched something small and hard. The brooch. A pewter brooch with scalloped lace-like edges. Any other detail rotted away by the seawater. She pulled it from her algae just as a massive dark shape jetted right toward her. She kicked off the seafloor, brooch in hand, and Grizzle cruised underneath her feet, a deliberate miss. A shark Grizzle's size never misses its prey. She knew it would be her last warning. Fidelia scrambled to the surface, her lungs burning and her legs tingling, expecting at any moment to receive a chomp, but the shark didn't follow her. He swam in circles around the base of the coral, his tail flicking. She had to get air, now. Every fiber of her body was screaming for her to break the surface and breathe. But why didn't the shark follow her? He'd exhibited all signs of predatory behavior and had clearly viewed her as a threat. Why was he still hovering by the reef? She paused and peeked back into the depths. Her view was fuzzy, but she saw why Grizzle wasn't coming after her. He was guarding his own precious treasure. 3 shark pups darted out of the algae on the sea floor, each about a foot in length. They snapped their jaws at each other, sibling rivalry ingrained even at this early age. Baby grizzlings. Fidelia's heart flittered, her entire body itching with joy. She wished she could stay and watch. So little was known about larger sharks and their parenting behaviors, particularly males. But her primal instincts took over, and her legs kicked until her head broke through the water as if she had shattered a window. Then she spat out the water eater and her lips finally found air. She drank it greedily, her body convulsing with relief. She was too tired to swim, to tread water, to kick to the boat. Her head bobbed back under the water. For the 3rd time in as many days, Cheap Shot Charlie grabbed under her arms and lifted her into the jewel. Seawater drained from her nose. So your supergills worked, Merrick said. Fidelia hacked until her throat was clear. So it seems, she retorted, and Merrick grinned at her cheek. Bloody Elle draped a dry tunic around her shoulders, and Fidelia pulled apart her water eater to examine the filtration system. The parrot feather leaf was shredded, only fibers. Of course, after a certain amount of breaths, the harsh seawater had dissolved the leaf past the usage point. Even though it had nearly killed her, she smiled, because she had figured it out. Her next prototype would allow for easy removal of the leaves so a diver could replace the filter when the oxygen slowed. She'd actually done it, and she'd done it without her parents. But of course, she knew they had still helped her solve it, their observation books, their blood flowing through her veins, their lifetime of research. Even in the midst of her glee, her heart panged. If only they were here to see her, to see what they had helped her create, to see the daughter they had raised. Merrick coughed as he searched her over for wounds with the scrutiny of a surgeon. That shark started patrolling these waters the last few times we visited, he said. I knew I needed the very best shark expert to deal with him and get my brooch. Well, Fidelia said, opening her palm, here it is. I hope it's worth it. She finally got her first good look at it with clear eyes. It was ugly. A dingy piece of jewelry, and not salvageable at all. Not worthy of any money, not becoming for a fashionable woman to wear. Not worthy of Fidelia's life. The salt water had decayed most of the shine, and the fastening pin on the back was broken, irreparable. All this trouble for a piece of garbage, Fidelia said, then winced. But Merrick didn't snap at her. He stared at the rotted piece of metal in her hand, then pierced her with that haunting blue eye of his. Thank you, he whispered. He took the brooch from her. His skin was more purple than flesh-colored. The veins bulged between his hand bones like rivers between skeletal peaks. A dying pirate, drowning in his own phlegm and blood, all for a pewter brooch. She had to know why. Why this brooch? She asked, so only he could hear. What's it for? Before he could answer, a shout rang out. At last I have you, monstrous. A huge frigate approached, its red and blue flags waving boldly in the breeze. Even from the distance, Fidelia could make out the guns, at least 20 of them, on this side alone, jutting from the ship like spines on a sea urchin, and all of them aimed at the jewel. A hog-like man stood at the helm, his golden blunderbuss drawn. A hay-like mustache twitched above his lip, and a dainty pair of spectacles perched at the end of his lumpy nose. How many times must I kill you, Merrick? The man hollered. At least one more time, it would seem, Bilgewater. Merrick called back. Fidelia saw new life surge in his face. He clenched the brooch until his bony knuckles whitened. Bridgewater. Bloody Al's lips crimped into a hateful sneer. Look at him. His eyes are so close together. He should be wearing a monocle. Fidelia studied the man on the frigate. So this was the dreaded Admiral Bridgewater. But he didn't look like much of a nemesis for Merrick. Sort of like a grandfather with a pooch around his middle, who made everyone listen to his war stories and refused to take off his decorated uniform. I see you've managed to resurrect the jewel, Admiral Bridgewater said. What's holding that pile of driftwood together? Pure luck? He lifted his nose in disgust. The ship matches the captain, I always say. Would you like a ride? Merrick asked. There's a spot down on the hull for you. You'll get a nice view of the seabed. Naval officers in cobalt blue jackets burst from the mother dog's hatches like bees leaving a hive. They rove to the jewel in longboats, enough to be a scourge. This wasn't like the Mulvanian pirates' takeover of the jewel. This was an admiral of the Queen's own navy. This was the rescue Fidelia had been waiting for. But even if she reached for it, she couldn't feel a shred of relief. She didn't want to leave Merrick's side, she realized. Not like this. Not when he was so fragile. Merrick must have seen her tense, because he placed a hand on her shoulder. Steady, he murmured. This will all be over soon. Fidelia exhaled a shaky breath. Steady, she repeated to herself. The Navy's longboats rowed closer. Cheapshot Charlie pulled his pistol from his belt. Our orders, Captain? Bloody Elle snaked her white blonde hair back into a braid as she glared. If her eyes were weapons, Admiral Bridgewater would be tatters in the water. She, too, readied her gun and kissed the barrel for luck. Surrender now, Merrick, Admiral Bridgewater called. and I'll make sure the sharks can't get the biggest pieces of you." The mother dog's long boots knocked into the side of the Jewel, a horrible sound, like a drumbeat of war. "Captain," Cheapshot Charlie said, "they're here. What are your orders?" Merrick took his gun and spat out a gob of blood. "Your orders are to jump," the captain said, and aimed his gun right between Cheapshot Charlie's eyes. Chapter 23. "Captain, no," Bloody L cried. "Bridgewater will shoot you as soon as he gets the treasure." "I am a dead man already," Merrick said. "Bridgewater will take the treasure, and he will take the Jewel. And then he'll hang the two of you, if he doesn't kill you right here." Cheapshot Charlie didn't move. Merrick's gun still pointed at his forehead. "We stay and fight," he said. "This is an order from your captain." A bead of sweat rolled down Merrick's forehead as he cocked his pistol. Cheapshot Charlie and Bloody L didn't even flinch. The naval sailors were scrambling up their grappling ropes. "I'm warning you, Charlie." Merrick's hand shook, his pistol rattling. "Jump now, or I'll shoot." "Then shoot me," Cheapshot Charlie said. "I'm not leaving." Merrick cursed, then lowered his aim and pulled the trigger. The shot hit Cheapshot Charlie's leg. The pirate doubled over with the pain, clenching his muscle as blood soaked his pants. Fidelia screamed, the burn of gunpowder piercing her nostrils. "Captain, stop." Bloody L whipped off her headscarf and pressed it to Cheapshot Charlie's wound. Merrick readied another ball in his pistol, aiming it at Bloody L this time. "I said go." His black and red eye twitched in its socket. "What are you doing?" Fidelia yelped. The mother dog was now parallel, close enough that Fidelia could see the sails of the Jewel reflected in the frigate's shiny guns. "I'm giving them a fighting chance," Merrick said, "which is more than Bridgewater will give them." "No, I won't abandon my ship." Bloody L's lip trembles. "Nor will I," Cheapshot Charlie gritted out. "Not until it's finished." "Please, go." The sound of Merrick begging, even as he held his pistol steady, it broke Fidelia's heart. "This is your last order." But it was too late. Naval seamen leaped over the railing, swarming the Jewel's warped deck. Bloody L and Cheapshot Charlie were tackled and cuffed. Merrick's wrist and ankles were bound, his pistol thrown overboard, sinking into the seabed, perhaps finding its way into his cave of treasures. He lay trussed on the floor in his own ship like a worm, coughing miserably at the strain. A pair of sailors seized Fidelia's arms and held her, unsure what to make of her. Fidelia let them. She had no fight left in her. Merrick had shot his own man, his own boatswain. But not out of monstrousness, no, out of mercy. It was as unexpected and jarring as seeing Grizzle, massive toothy Grizzle, the most powerful and primeval of all the sea creatures. A terrifying living dinosaur, protecting his three pups. Merrick the monstrous, yes, but not a monster. As that was, perhaps, the most unsettling discovery of all. The inevitable transfer happened. Bloody L, Cheapshot Charlie, Merrick, and Fidelia were lowered into a longboat and rowed over to the frigate, officially in naval custody. "Search that sorry excuse for a ship," Admiral Bridgewater commanded his officers. "Every board, every cranny. Find it all." "Go ahead and search, you old..." Before Merrick could finish his insult, he erupted in a fit of coughs, flopping against the mother dog's railings. Admiral Bridgewater's grin only brightened, his eyes replaced by 2 gold coins. "Run that mouth of yours all you want, monstrous," he said, "because today, at last, I have it." The naval crew spread across the Jewel like cockroaches swarming a larder. They touched every inch of the ship, lifting every loose board, jammed the butts of their guns into knotholes to widen them. Bits of wood flew from the ship, a storm of splinters. Merrick watched in silence as the Navy violated his ship, his face chiseled in stone, so calm. Fidelia spotted his left hand, tied between his back, squeeze in his ropes. The brooch, he still had it. Bridgewater's men hadn't found it, not yet. The most valuable of all of his treasures, he'd called it. Merrick had pulled a lot of tricks, scuttling the jewel in a forest lake to keep it hidden, escaping from the Navy's inescapable prison. And those were just the ones Fidelia knew about. But as the sailors swept the jewel for treasure, she hoped, with every bit of quail blood she had, that he had one final card to play, one last trick in him, a way to keep that brooch. After everything he'd done for it, he had died to get it. The Navy crew found nothing aboard the jewel. Of course they didn't, not on this rickety old ship held together by only slivers and nostalgia. Fidelia waited for an outburst from the Admiral, for gunfire and threats, but Admiral Bridgewater wasn't fazed. He raised a ham-like fist in the air and called to his men, "Bring me the suit." His officers carried a sea chest from the Admiral's quarters out to the main deck, and Fidelia started when they opened it. "The diving suit," she cried. So that's why it wasn't in the garden shed back on Arborley Island. The Admiral had stolen it for himself. The Admiral turned his beady eyes on her. "You're their daughter, aren't you? Those fishy scientists, the pheasants." "It's quail," Fidelia said. Admiral Bridgewater sniffed. He couldn't care less about names. Her name, their name. "That suit and helmet are university property," she informed him. "My men commandeered it, in the name of the Queen." Admiral Bridgewater yanked the canvas suit up and over his body, somehow managing to zip his bulk inside the rubber. "Shall I have Her Majesty personally sign it out?" Fidelia watched him secure the diving helmet, one of his officers twisting the corselets into place. "Break off," she ordered fiercely. "You old rusty screws, fall off." She willed any of the usual problems the quails had with the diving suit to manifest: a crack in the glass visor, a split in the canvas, a leak in the rubber, but the Admiral looked every speck of the part of a real diver. He opened the helmet's visor, holding his arms aloft while the officers inflated the suit. "I knew I'd catch you, monstrous. I knew I was the bigger, stronger, faster animal. How does it feel now to have my teeth around your throat?" He grinned, his cheeks flushing triumphantly pink. "And here comes the bite." "To the officers," he said, "if any one of them attempts a whiff of escape, blow their heads off. That includes the girl." He snapped the visor shut and tipped himself backward over the railing of the mother dog, splashing into the turquoise water. A weighted net was lowered over the side of the mother dog, and it sank into the water after him. Silence washed over the two ships, broken only by a ghastly wet cough. Then they waited. June 4th. Today's the day. I'm so anxious I can't hardly write straight. Today's the day I try my new submarine. We picked the perfect spot for a test run, a continental reef ledge on the east side of Arborley that attracts all manner of pelagic creatures around the summer: crustaceans, octopuses, sea turtles, and of course, sharks. On a hot day like today, it's going to be Shark City. I've made smaller scale submarines before: the Ocean Soaker, the Aqua Flood, the Wave Walker, but nothing as ambitious as this. The Egg is a full-size mechanical submarine with propellers. It's capable of 100-foot depths, at least, I think it is. I've made sure the chambers are properly pressurized for deep-sea diving. I've called it the Egg because it's shaped like one. The chandler was running a sail on some old cans of aquamarine paint. Fidelia watched Merrick's face, hog-tied and breathless. There was no crooked smirk, no hardened jaw, no inferno in that blue eye of his. Merrick got what he wanted, she reminded herself, the pathetic brooch in his hand. Still, her heart ached for him. He was about to watch his worst enemy pull up his life's work. Bridgewater would spend every bit of his great wealth that had taken Merrick years to compile, and Merrick would be fertilizing daisies. We've just sailed out. It's a perfect sunny day, nothing but blue sky and blue water. It's teeming out there, busier than the canal on a Monday morning. I tried tracking fins. I lost count at 30 sharks. We've got a bunch of duskies, tons of black tips, some nurses munching on crabs, and a tiger shark, who took off as soon as we anchored the boat. They're all hovering around the drop-off, right where the reef's ledge ends and deeper water begins. right where we're going to lower the egg and see if it works. Dad's going to man the platypus while Mom and I go below, crossing my fingers, my toes, and all my insides that this works. The net emerged from the sea, and despite herself, tears fell from Fidelia's eyes, steaming up her glasses. There it was, the net nearly the size of the frigate itself, full of the world's largest accumulation of wealth, sparkling gems, gold doubloons, silver chandeliers. Admiral Bridgewater sputtered as he wrenched open the visor of the divot helmet. "Reel me in." Fidelia looked at Bloody Elle and Cheap Shot Charlie. They were shockingly still. Bloody Elle stared down at her own toes, and Cheap Shot Charlie's gaze was already beyond the horizon, finding anything else to focus on while their cave was plundered. "Stop him," Fidelia wants to cry. "You're the greatest pirates who ever lived. Break free from your ropes and get your treasure." Merrick met her eyes, and she brushed her tears onto her shoulder. Wait until all the sailors back home heard that the legend of the Red Daisies ended with a cheap pewter brooch. "It works. I'm writing this from the inside of my very own submarine. A very curious nurse shark keeps bumping her nose against the porthole." "Tell her to come on in. It's nice and cozy," Mom said, and held up her tea and cheers. "That's right, tea. The egg is working so well, and it's so smooth that we've been down here for nearly 3 hours. Mom went topside for a bit so Dad could have some time in the sub. This is going to change everything," he kept saying, using the periscope anchor to spin the egg 360 degrees around. "You wait and see, Fidelia. You've just revolutionized our line of work. I don't know which I'm more excited about, the things that happen today or the things that could happen tomorrow." Admiral Bridgewater's officers pried the suit off his uniform, still pristinely ironed and starched beneath the canvas. The treasure was carted off to the Admiral's quarters. It took 24 men, several trips each to carry all of it. "What happens now?" Fidelia asked Merrick softly. He clicked his tongue. "Don't let him scare you, Quail," he said. "He'll get you home in one piece." Her throat strained. "I meant, what happens to you?" Another one of her incessant questions. There was that crooked half-smile. "Don't you worry about me," he said. "You just tell that old aunt of yours." He toppled over in a fit of uncontrollable coughing. Blood speckled the spotless deck. "Stand him up," Admiral Bridgewater said. Officers snatched Merrick and pulled him upright. He wavered, still coughing, until at last he found his balance. Admiral Bridgewater came inches away from the pirate. "In another lifetime, Merrick, you and I could have made a team for the ages. If only the Navy had beaten all of that sauce out of you." His piggy eyes disappeared into the flesh of his face. "You could have been the next me." Merrick lifted his chin. "I would have tied my own noose if I ever became a bilge rat like you." The corners of Fidelia's mouth sprang up. This was why Merrick would always win, she realized. Admiral Bridgewater didn't really want to kill Merrick. He wanted to kill Merrick's arrogance, tame him. And since the Admiral never would, he'd have to settle for killing Merrick the Monstrous instead. Admiral Bridgewater's elation was blown clean off his face. "We shall all see the great Merrick the Monstrous hang, just like every other black-hearted pirate." "That's right, Monstrous," he whispered as he leaned over Merrick, seawater dripping off his soggy mustache. "You may have fancied yourself the king of the 9 seas, but you're going to die in the same way as every other sea dog who decided to sail under a red flag, dancing the hempen jig, where anyone who wishes can watch you take your last breath. But first," he rubbed one of his silver buttons, polishing it spotless with the tip of his thumb. "Gunners, at your ready." The mother dog's cannons were already powdered, loaded, and aimed. The gunners awaited their signal. Fidelia followed their sight lines, and her heart leaped into her throat. "Do something," she said to Merrick and Charlie and Elle. "Save your ship, your lucky ship." Her heart screeched as it flapped into her mouth, circling and desperate. Merrick's face was still marbleized. With some relish, Admiral Bridgewater shouted, "Fire!" The cannons were deafening. They exploded with black clouds of smoke, blasting giant splintered holes into the side of the Jewel. Tears fogged Fidelia's glasses as the Jewel's toppled foresail caught fire. She could still see the ghost of Bloody Elle, her long corn silk hair whipping in the breeze as she inspected a line, and there, her eyes found the spot on the boards that Cheap Shot Charlie had scoured with the holy stone, scrubbing away pond scum, gone now, only ash. Again! Fire at will! Take it out! Admiral Bridgewater had fallen under a spell, his eyes glazed over, the hairs in his mustache standing at attention, emanating steam and fire and red. His men reloaded and shot, and shot, and shot. Fidelia's ears rang. Somewhere, she thought she'd heard singing. Was that Cheap Shot Charlie again, droning his 3-note morning song? No, the boatswain's mouth was closed. He looked like he would never sing again. The shots finally ended, whether by Bridgewater's command or because they had run out of ship to shoot at, Fidelia didn't know. When the smoke cleared, the Jewel was a pile of kindling, and Fidelia watched each little blackened stick fall through the water. The red flag, thundered through a grape shot, floated for a second on the sea's surface before it, too, sank and was lost forever. Fidelia buried her face with her hands and sobbed. "Take them below," Admiral Bridgewater ordered, "but keep them separated. And put a gag on Merrick. He's spoken his last words." "What about the girl?" the officer said, clutching Fidelia's elbow roughly. Admiral Bridgewater considered her. "Put her in the barracks," he finally prescribed, "but if she gives you any trouble, take her below with the others." Cheap Shot Charlie and Bloody Elle were removed first, dragged to a hatch and pushed inside. Fidelia stared at the trail of blood left by Charlie's injured leg. 2 sailors carried Merrick down to the hold, not even giving him a chance to use his legs, just towing him off like a rabid dog on a leash. The mother dog set sail, heading north. Back to civilization, back to the real world, where pirates were criminals to be hanged, not comrades, not men to be pitied, not clever or brave or hopelessly tragic. A world where a cave of red daisies could exist only in a sailor's yarns. A world where a girl who was kidnapped would be best off just forgetting all about it. Fidelia was escorted to a dingy dark bunk on the lower deck, and she couldn't tell if the sound of howling was the wind thrusting them back to Arberley much faster than she wanted, or Merrick moaning and coughing beneath the deck boards. 2 years earlier. Water held ships. It held creatures in all shapes and form and disposition. Water also held memories. It was the perfect vessel for them. Merrick would be sailing across the white Arctic Sea, weaving through a labyrinth of icy caps, and the water would suddenly gift him with the remembrance of the day he defected from the Navy, his first battle with Admiral Bridgewater, a success, a happy day, happy memory. He would be sailing across the golden waves of the Mulvanian coast, and again the water would present him with a memory, as if it had been storing it for him. The memory of his first raid, that first pillage of a beanie ship, and the giddy night he spent counting gold in his quarters. That night he didn't think of all the things he would buy, but of how this would be considered a dismal amount of gold, pathetic compared to how much he'd take before the reign of Merrick the Monstrous came to its glorious end. He could sail across the blues and grays of Arberley Bay, and remember the first time he saw her, a green dress flapping on the boardwalk, her hair blowing free, her eyes on him and his ship as though she'd never seen something so wild. A bittersweet memory, to be sure. These days more bitter than sweet. But for all its good memories, the water also offered the wretched ones. The time he'd lost her, the one honest thing he'd ever given her, falling between the waves as if it were just a brooch made of cheap metal, and not a piece of his very heart. Even that, paled in contrast to this latest memory, the worst battle he'd ever lost. Losses too terrible to face. He wished he could remove the memory from this night completely from his mind, drop it into the sea like an old bone, Hear it plop and watch it sink into the silver churn, the shark snatching it up. But the water couldn't keep it forever. It would stir the memory up if he ever came this way again, if he ever sailed across the coral of the damned again. Then he'd remember the slick of his deck boards, blood rolling along the surface and dripping off into the sea. The sight of a head lolling against his feet, one of the crew members, but drenched and disfigured like a bruised fruit. The sounds, oh God, the sounds of slaughter. The mother dogs braying canyons, hurling great balls of terror, and the Jewel's pitiful retaliating gunshots, tiny nips from a puppy in comparison. The cries of his crew, grown men and women who lost limbs for him over the years and tattooed their skin with the tips of their blades on the wavering sea, and survived the near starvation and mental torture of long journeys. Never had Merrick heard them cry like this, the wails of beasts, trapped and awaiting their certain death. And above it all, the sound of Bridgewater laughing, as he carried out his butchery. Merrick's crew was picked off one at a time with the guns, or in whole groups by the cannons, until once again there was only Merrick and Bloody Elle and Cheap Shot Charlie, who helped him move the pulverized Jewel away from the scene at last, skimming through the shallow waters of the Coral of the Damned, where the mother dog couldn't follow. Merrick the monstrous retreated like a wounded animal. In the waters below, his men and women sank until their bodies bumped the sand. That's what they were now, just bodies. Bags for their bones, meat for the bottom feeders. And soon they too would just be sea and salt and memory. Merrick had plotted out the trip perfectly. He would sail to the prison barge, and Cheap Shot Charlie would distract the guards. Bloody Elle would take care of the dogs. Merrick would let everyone on the prison barge loose, crew or no, because the more people wandering free in the world, who were like him, who were pebbles in the Admiral's shoe, the better. And this is what happened. They broke out of the prison, everything unfolding according to plan. The crew had set the Jewel at a fair clip, and were already cheering their captain's victory when Admiral Bridgewater ambushed them, and then the bloodbath. A dreadful memory, one of the worst simmering in Merrick's mind. But then why, only a week after losing his crew, was it a different memory that kept pushing to the surface, a different loss? Her face plagued him day and night, awake or dreaming. The coldness in it as she dropped the brooch overboard, the feathery sound of her voice, the feel of her twirling around him as they danced, the softness of her lips against his skin. The memory of her was relentless. They sailed aimlessly for a week, trying to gather their bearings. Merrick watched the sea's spray cleanse the Jewel completely of blood. He watched, silent. After a week of hollow sleep and nightmares of waking daylight, Merrick spun the helm east. "Captain?" Bloody Elle said, a question and a concern all in one word. "We're going to the market," Merrick said, his jaw tense. "Good idea," Cheap Shot Charlie said. "We need to tar this hull before she springs a leak." "You do that," Merrick said, "but keep her steady to make a quick exit. Malvania is not going to like the storm I'm bringing." Bloody Elle and Cheap Shot Charlie exchanged a look. They'd been doing this lately, Merrick noticed. Of course he noticed. This was his job, as the captain, to oversee. He didn't care. Let them worry. Merrick stalked through the wet market with single-eyed purpose. The posters advertising for his dead or alive capture had tripled on the walls of the hash house. He barely noticed. Without a word, he walked up to the jeweler who had sold him the brooch and held a pistol against the jeweler's throat. "My watch," Merrick said. "Where is it?" The jeweler lifted a shaking finger. The table. Merrick's old watch, given to him by his father. The only thing Merrick had that was his, and he was taking it back. "That brooch you sold me was garbage," Merrick said. "I told you. You should have bought her diamonds," the jeweler replied, his breath stinking of tooth rot and fear. And then, as he regretted his cheek, his eyes widened. Just white holes with black circles floating, and he braced himself for the kill shot. But instead of blowing his head off, Merrick just laughed. He laughed the entire walk back through the market. He laughed when he got to the patched-up Jewel, and as their lousy, shaken three-man crew brought her to her full 20 knots, he laughed and laughed and laughed. And that is where we're going to stop today with Race to the Bottom of the Sea. We've just got 2 episodes left. Clearly not that much book left. Things are heating up. I will be out with another episode in the next couple of days, so I'll see you guys then. Bye!